In human-robot collaboration, failures are inevitable. This is because robots operate in uncertain, dynamic, real-world environments, where problems can come from perception limits, hardware constraints, and planning errors. And these failures may happen not just once, but repeatedly during interaction.
My name is Ramtin Tabatabaei, and this work was conducted with Vassilis Kostakos and Wafa Johal at the University of Melbourne. This work received an Honourable Mention Award.
In this work, we investigate how repeated robot failures and the robot awareness of those failures shape human trust and perceived intelligence.
So our study focuses on three main questions. First, we investigate how different patterns of repeated robot failures influence user trust and their perception of the robot's intelligence. In particular, we compare situations where the same type of failure repeat with the situation where different type of failures occur. Second, we examine how different trust repair strategies affect user perceptions. Specifically, we look at how the robot level of awareness of its failure interact with different failure types, including freezing, planning, and grasping failures to influence trust and perceived intelligence. Third, we explore how the severity of robot failures influence user trust and their perception of the robot's intelligence during a sequence of failures.
Most prior research focuses on single robot failures, but in real-world interaction, robots often fail repeatedly, and repeated failures introduce extra complexity, because people don't judge each failure in isolation. Instead, they form expectations over time. These repeated failures can follow different patterns. Sometimes the same type of failure happens again and again. We call this a homogeneous failure sequence. Other times, different kinds of failures happen across the interaction. We call this a heterogeneous failure sequence. This distinction matters because users build expectations during interaction. Repeated identical failures may be interpreted as a specific limitation, while varied failures make the robot appear less predictable and harder to understand. Also, after a robot makes a mistake, it may or may not be aware of it. That awareness could come from an internal diagnostic system or from interpreting the user's social reactions, such as gaze or facial expression. So our question is not just whether robots fail, but also whether they fail consistently or inconsistently, and whether they appear to understand their own mistakes.
We designed a collaborative task based on a tangram puzzle, where the robot and a human take turns placing pieces into a silhouette to form a specific shape. The task is repeated 6 times, and participants encounter robot failures during the 2nd, 4th, and 6th rounds.
We manipulated two main factors. First, failure patterns. In the homogeneous condition, the participant experienced the same type of failure 3 times. In the heterogeneous condition, the participants experienced 3 different failure types, one after another. Second, full awareness. We tested 3 levels. No awareness. The robot gives no reaction. Partial awareness. The robot indicates that something may have gone wrong, but doesn't know exactly what. Full awareness. The robot identifies the failure, explains it, and if it is required to be corrected, the robot does it. We introduced 3 different failure types which are common in manipulation and collaborative tasks.
The first one was a freezing failure, where the robot froze for about 15 seconds while holding the piece in its end effector before resuming the placement. The second one was a planning failure, where the robot placed the intended piece in the location of a different piece within the silhouette. The third one was a grasping failure, where the robot didn't fully close its gripper and therefore failed to pick up and place the piece.
We evaluated this with 54 participants in a lab study. They reported their trust and perceived intelligence of the robot after each failure during the interaction. We found that heterogeneous failure sequences reduce perceived intelligence more than homogeneous sequences, especially at the second failure. In other words, when the robot fails in different ways over time, people judge it as less intelligent than when it repeated the same kind of failure. One possible explanation is related to expectancy violation theory. Repeated similar failures become predictable, while varied failures violate people's expectations more strongly. For grasping and planning failures, a robot that shows partial or full awareness was rated significantly higher than a robot with no awareness. This was true for both trust and perceived intelligence. So when the failures is clear and noticeable, people expect some sign that the robot understands what went wrong. For freezing failure, awareness didn't significantly improve rating. Awareness cues during freezing failure may even be unnecessary because many participants interpreted freezing failure as a simple processing time rather than a serious failure. So we can say awareness matters most for planning and grasping failures, but not necessarily for freezing failure, which many users perceive as mild. Participants rated planning and grasping as a high severity failures and freezing as a low severity failure. We also found that trust was influenced not only by the current failure, but also the severity of previous failure. So trust is not purely momentary, it carries history. A severe failure after a mild one can hurt trust more strongly because it violates the user emerging expectations. Perceived intelligence, however, seems to depend more on the current failure than on the previous one. To better understand this result, we also conducted a reflexive semantic analysis of the participants' open-ended responses after the task. When the robot showed no awareness, participants described confusion, such as "I was very lost and unsure whether to help or not," and frustration, such as the instance where it didn't make a reaction annoyed me, and perceived incompetence, such as the fact that the robot didn't react or comment on its mistake made it look like it couldn't think. When the robot showed full awareness, participants described autonomous competence. For example, his awareness of the mistake and his ability to quickly fix the mistake impressed me. Explanatory apology. For example, I felt more pleased when the robot indicated the reason for its mistake and apologized. And a human-like social presence. For example, I felt it was more lively and human-like. In real-world collaboration, robots will fail repeatedly. So the key design question is not only how to avoid failures, but also how robots should respond when the failures happen repeatedly. Our result highlights three main takeaways. First, failure patterns matter. When robots fail in different ways over time, users perceive them as less intelligent than when the same type of failure repeats. Second, robot awareness helps repair trust, especially when failures are clear and noticeable. When the robot acknowledged planning or grasping mistake, users rated them as more trustworthy and intelligent. Third, trust evolves across the interaction. User trust was influenced not only by the current failure, but also by the severity of the previous failure. For the robot designers, we suggest, firstly, acknowledging failures when they are obvious to the user, particularly for the planning and grasping failures. And secondly, designing robots with consistent behavior, because varied failures may be harder for the users to interpret.
Thank you for watching. For more details about this study and related work, please scan the QR code to visit my website, where you can find the paper and related projects.